Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives, the Cedar Creek Midweek podcast that I almost forgot the name of for a second there. I'm Josh Kramer. With me in the Cedar Creek studios are Pastor Jason Cans and Pastor Mark Anderson. This past weekend, Jason spoke on goodness, the second teaching in a three-part series on truth, goodness, and beauty. There was no Friday night service, so Jason was the only one who talked, but Pastor Mark has graciously agreed to come in here and have a little conversation with us. So, gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thanks for allowing us to be here.
Jason, do you want to give a little bit of a recap of what you talked about?
Sure. So, again, the series that we've been doing is focused on truth, goodness, and beauty, kind of as the three-legged stool that makes for a complete faith. And so this week we talked about goodness, and we'll probably get into this, but the question about what is goodness. So does it reflect virtue? Does it reflect righteousness? We touched on that a little bit, but as I talked, I talked about how in society, the idea of goodness is sometimes mixed up in terms of what people think to be good. Satan called into question goodness, and we live in a society where goodness is a little bit questioned. And then we come to what do we read about in the Gospels, and we find that God is good. It says in Psalm 119:68, God is good and what he does is good. And so we have a God who taught us about goodness, who showed us goodness, and we then are called to live in light of that, to be good people, to do good, to live good and righteous lives. Again, one of those questions that comes up is, what is the difference between goodness and righteousness? And we may get there, but generally the idea was, what does a virtuous or a good life look like as believers?
All right. Very good. Well, thank you for that. Listeners, if you haven't heard that teaching, it is available on the website at seacreek.org/sermons, or wherever you found this podcast. Just look one step back, and there should be a recording from Jason's Sunday morning teaching. So, Mark, what would you have done instead if you had given...
Well, if I had been teaching on no.
I think that's a good question. What would you have done?
Not to put you on the spot.
I would have done just the very same thing you did, Jason.
Right. Unity.
That's right.
That's what I like to see out of my pastoral leadership.
Well, it was interesting because after the first sermon, the one that's uploaded online is the second service, but after the first service, I talked with both Mark and Rob, my two co-pastors, and both of them sort of said, I was a little confused as to what you were saying, and I felt the same way. It's one of the things as pastors you may not always see, but sometimes we just feel like we're in choppy waters up there, and that is certainly how I felt during the first teaching. And Mark had rightly asked, so definitionally, what is goodness? What are you after? And I think that was a good question for me to think about, that I fleshed out a little bit better in the second teaching. Because I think it does have elements of righteousness, righteous living, righteous behavior, but it also has kind of I don't even know how to describe, just a moral goodness, I think is how, you looked up a bunch of definitions. I'm curious.
As I was talking to Jason on Sunday, he used righteousness and goodness interchangeably a couple of times, and so I was thinking about that and if they are synonymous, and they are virtually. I was telling him I still open a dictionary now and then. I like to look at
like a paper one, or do you
like
use...
a paper one,
wow,
a big fat paper one, and goodness, under good there's about 18 different definitions. And so I looked up righteous, and they're very similar. It's morally sound, virtuous, etc. But I kind of think of goodness as kind of when you put your feet to your righteousness, almost. Goodness is how that has worked out in relationship, how it's worked out in our actions. That's kind of, in my simple way of thinking, that's kind of I approach it.
Yeah.
And that's what I asked Jason, are they the same? Are we talking about righteousness? Because, that implies kind of holding up a standard, and goodness has maybe softer edges. I don't know.
That's a good way to describe it, and I would agree. I think righteousness can certainly have, hard elements to it. When you think about the Pharisees who really pursued righteous behavior, that often had very hard edges to it. You look at the character of Christ, who certainly was righteous, but was goodness embodied. I think most of us would say much of the time he seemed to have softer edges.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I'm not sure you'd describe a Pharisee. You might describe a Pharisee as righteous, but maybe not good.
Right. Exactly. That's a good point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just thinking as you're saying that last week during the discussion on truth, you talked about how, truth, goodness, and beauty for this series are kind of, came out of maybe more philosophical thinking than theological thinking. So the righteousness part definitely hits on the theological part of it, but it's from a philosophical way of thinking about goodness. It's just kind of things that are the way that they should be or something.
Right.
I don't really know what the philosophical definition of goodness is, but it, certainly that wholeness and rightness of action. I don't know what.
Well, I think historically, if you look at what the philosophers said, I mean, it was a question of virtue.
Sure.
It was the development of character. But again, that may depend culture to culture. What do you mean by virtue? I think Plato would have said there is a standard for what is virtuous, and he explored some of that. And I think the argument is easily made that Christianity best represents what a virtuous character looks like. But
yeah, I would be curious to hear that definition coming from someone who isn't necessarily associated with the church or with any particular objective standard, like how they try to define what is good.
Right.
So kind of along those lines, one of the things that we were briefly discussing before we started recording was the idea of the church a lot of times gets a reputation as kind of being that stickler for quote-unquote morality or good behavior in sometimes a very superficial sort of way. But we were just talking about some scriptures. Mark was saying that I think it was Peter that you said tells the church to have good behavior in front of unbelievers. That's a thing that we should do. Is there a good way to go about that you think without kind of furthering the maybe bad reputation that the church has for being overly concerned with behavior and not necessarily with anything deeper than that?
I think that's kind of gets back to the righteousness and goodness, because I think the church Christians have felt that they need to be the standard of, or hold up a standard of righteousness in their culture, and so then as they do that, and if they speak up in their culture and oppose certain unrighteousness, then they are typified as being judgmental and critical and mean-spirited, because they are speaking up contrary to the going way of thinking. Whereas goodness, and the church can swing the other way, and let's not uphold righteousness, let's just do good.
Right.
And so, and that again, that some who would lean towards holding up righteousness would say, well, then they've sold out and they're just, doing good. And so somewhere there's the true function of the church in there. Yeah, Jason's going to tell us what that is.
I'm really looking forward to
that. I think that's very accurate, and unfortunately or fortunately, that often runs along political lines.
Sure.
In the 80s, the whole emergence of the moral majority, showing up, holding up a high standard of morality within culture, often aligned with political conservatives. You know, it was a call to high righteousness or high moral standards, not just for believers, but for everybody. Now we come to a time where all of a sudden some of those cracks are appearing in the foundation of what we have put forth as righteousness in the past, or people who have put themselves forth as righteous. Mm-hmm. And so now all of a sudden I don't know about all of a sudden, but increasingly seeing this: Christian, you have no right to speak to my behavior if you are also behaving in that way. For me, I think one of those questions about how do you uphold a standard is, in a culture that may be opposed to what we're doing, I think is being honest. I think one of the things that I had said was it's important to be honest with, I am not a perfect person. It's easy for us to say, well, I would never do that. I would never behave that way, but we do. You know, as believers, we can be judgmental, we can be bigoted, we can be hateful, arrogant, lustful. Pick any list of character traits, and it's important for us to own where we trip up, where we fall, but to point to one who does have a higher standard for us, who calls us to a life of goodness. The idea of, and it says in 1 Thessalonians 5, do good to everyone. So how are we loving and serving those who we disagree with? I think that can be hard for us sometimes. We have an easier time doing service work, mission work to people who think and look like we do, but to do that with people who may not fit our standard it becomes more challenging. I think of the 80s when there were subsets of people who were ministering to the AIDS community, and they got pushback on that. And why would you do that? You know, what would it look like for us to minister to the Muslim community? I mean, those are good questions for us. What would it look like to do good to those who have an opposite system of belief that we do? I think those are questions we need to wrestle with.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that verse says do good to everyone, not make sure everyone does good.
That's an important clarifier, absolutely.
Well, and I only say that just because it seems like, you know, with my experience in like the workplace, or, you know, with being on the internet or anything, which is a terrible place to get examples like this, I guess, but that's kind of the impression that people have of Christians. It's, you know, when coworkers, you know, will use profanity around you and then kind of look at you and say, "Oh, I'm sorry," like that's the impression that they have, is that you're just kind of judging them all the time for their behavior, when like that's not my goal at all. Mm-hmm. But that seems like it's kind of the impression, is that Christians are just kind of the no fun, you know, you have to act right all the time, even though everybody knows they don't actually do it.
Right. And again, I think it's something that we pursue, and I think I tried to make this point on Sunday, that still that concept of training versus trying, that you know, we are ambassadors, we are disciples who are in training to try and become more like Jesus, you know, and will we succeed at that this side of heaven? No, but we continue to pursue righteousness, to grow in goodness and righteousness. Sometimes that can come across as haughty or proud, that we're further along than other people might be, and that can come across as judgmental. And maybe thinking back to the idea of goodness versus righteousness, I wonder if goodness is righteousness without the associated judgment. Maybe not. I don't know. Because I think sometimes when we use the word righteous, it implies judgment of others. Maybe not, but I would wonder if that is the case.
Yeah.
Well, back to Josh's coworker illustration. You know, if you're interacting with your coworker and your goal is to demonstrate your righteousness, that makes a certain set of behaviors. If you're seeking to do them good and to be good, that's a whole different picture. And in my mind, I get a whole different picture. I don't get a picture of someone with a stick, but someone with their hand out, seeking to do good to that person, regardless. And how that's carried out in, I think the workplace is a good, but anywhere with our neighbors, I was thinking, how can we be extraordinarily good so that it would be like Josh alluded to in 1 Peter, that people would notice that you're somehow different, because people in our town, people in my workplace, do many good things for each other. How do we distinguish ourselves as believers doing good?
Do you have an answer for that?
No, that's a question. I asked a question.
And I think that's a difficult one. Certainly for me, I think that trying to think about how to distinguish ourselves can be difficult. I think there's a seeking consistency of character. Are you the type of person who is good, not just doing good acts? And I think we would all agree that there's a desire to become the type of person who would automatically do good things, not I'm doing good things for the purpose of doing good things, but it's just a natural outflow of who I am.
Sure.
Occasionally I will meet somebody where it's just very evident that God's Spirit flows through them. They just seem to have a radiance to them. And I don't wonder, I'm quite certain Jesus had that, that there was a radiance to him that people were drawn to. Some of that, I suspect, wasn't because, oh my goodness, he's doing everything right, but there was just an inherent sense of, this is a good person. As they watched him heal others. There's always that question, what stirred for the Pharisees, who were judging his behavior? Did they look at that and say, yeah, maybe that's a good action, but it breaks the law? What stirred for them when they saw that?
Yeah. That the verse you shared in 1 Corinthians 10 about seeking the good of your neighbor, that's in the context of questionable activities, but the one thing there, it says not to seek your own good, and I think that can distinguish our goodness. Oftentimes, is that where we set aside our own desires or set aside our own pride or whatever to serve and to elevate those around us. I think in the workplace is a good place to do that, because oftentimes the workplace is a competitive place. Is a place that people are eager to get one up on others, unfortunately. And if you're there for the good of your coworkers, that may be one way that we would stand out in goodness. The
other-centeredness piece, for sure,
Yes.
I think distinguishes, or should distinguish, Christianity a lot. And there's an interesting article written several years ago by a guy named Matthew Paris. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. I think he's a British journalist, atheist British journalist. And he wrote an article about kind of mission work in Africa. And there's a lot of Christian missions in Africa, and there's a lot of non-Christian missions. And he said, there's something distinct about Christians. They do this better than the rest of us do, and I don't know why. And it was kind of there's something about them. And I think that represents that goodness that can distinguish between believers and non-believers. And there's that sense, okay, I can't put my finger on it, but something is different here. Yeah, that difference is Jesus, and I think, again, that a true other-centeredness begins to inform and influence what we do. Now, the natural response to that is, don't seek your own good. Well, does that mean I'm supposed to let myself get abused and assaulted and whatnot by culture. Maybe, maybe that's the case. But are you willing to take licks for the purpose of the kingdom? I think is a good question for us to ask ourselves.
Yeah, you shared on Sunday that that the idea of doing good to everyone, and you asked the question: do you see others as image bearers first? Mm-hmm. And if we see others as those that bear the image of God, just like we do, mm-hmm. that may be why Christians do it differently.
Yeah. Do you think that's hard for us to view people not as their behavior, but as image bearers first? I think sometimes I'm able to operate from that perspective. And then there's sometimes where people's behavior just makes my blood boil. And I forget the idea that they're image bearers. And of course that speaks to my own judgmentalism and whatnot. But
we all can be Pharisees.
Yeah.
I think, because the behaviors you see in the New Testament by the Pharisees, they obviously weren't treating those around them as image bearers,
right?
But as folks to be, straightened out.
Yeah, lawbreakers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
without any hope, probably.
Yeah, you will never do it as well as I am, sort of idea.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not to incriminate myself, but it's hard enough to think that about other believers. To remember
right.
that they're also image bearers and that we're on the same side. That can be tough.
And how we perceive others definitely influences how we treat them. I mean, if we...
Yeah. And again, kind of tying it back to what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus not only saw, but actively approached those everybody else cast aside. Mm-hmm. Everybody, as people that were broken, lawbreakers who were to be left outside. I mean, the lepers are the most classic example. They were specifically to stand outside and say unclean. I mean, they were to acknowledge, I don't belong here. And Jesus saw them as bearing his image first, which allowed him to move toward those who most of us might move away from.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good thought to end on. I guess that was a fast 22 and a half minutes, but the time goes by. So just to wrap up, I guess I want to thank you both for your thoughts. Jason, thank you for your teaching. Mm-hmm. Next week, you will be back on Sunday morning to talk about beauty.
Right.
And there is also a Friday night teaching this week on that as well, right? Is that Matt Novacek?
Matt Novacek is teaching, yeah.
Is talking about beauty. So hopefully you will be able to join us for those teachings, listeners, Friday night at 7 p.m. or Sunday morning at 9 or 10:45. If you aren't able to be here, the recordings, of course, will be on the website for you to listen to. And we'll be back again next week to talk to Jason and Matt about their teachings on beauty, and that will wrap up that 3-part series. So we'll be back for that. Again, thank you, Jason and Mark, and everyone have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Music for this podcast provided by DNK via freemusicarchive.org.